intelligence cutouts. And the role of USAID is important because USAID in the 1980s was also used to send weapons on so-called humanitarian flights. This was admitted by Elliot Abrams, who came back in the Trump administration to oversee the Venezuela coup attempts. And Elliot Abrams in the 1980s would put weapons into so-called humanitarian flights to Nicaragua and later boasted about it in the New York Times. And in 2019, after the coup attempt failed in Nicaragua, in 2019, there was another coup attempt in Venezuela, but a different playbook, not as violent as 2017. This was with Juan Guaido. You probably remember in February, the US declared that Juan Guaido is the so-called interim president of Venezuela. And the US and Canada had been working with a series of countries, about 30 countries, to recognize Juan Guaido that week. Well, in that coup attempt in February 2019, after Juan Guaido self-declared fake interim president, in February, a month after he self-declared, on February 23rd, I was in Venezuela at the time, there was another coup operation on a bridge connecting Venezuela and Colombia. And the US, through USAID, tried to force through so-called humanitarian aid, which the United Nations condemned. The United Nations said this is not humanitarian aid because it's extremely political. This is politically motivated. It's not apolitical humanitarian aid. So actual humanitarian organizations condemn this, but USAID, along with the Defense Department and very likely US intelligence, we don't have the documents necessarily yet proving that the CIA was involved, but we have press releases from the Pentagon proving that USAID and the Pentagon were working together along with the State Department to try to force through these so-called aid convoys across the bridge into Venezuela. Now, Venezuela understood what was happening. This was yet another coup attempt and refused to allow the so-called aid convoy to go through. And then what happened later is that the far-right coup elements backed by Colombia and by the US lit the aid convoy on fire and then blamed it falsely on the Venezuelan government, which we reported at the Grayzone. My colleague Max Blumenthal correctly reported at the time, showing video that it was actually the coup elements backed by the US, not the Venezuelan government, that lit the so-called aid convoy on fire. That was actually later admitted by the New York Times months after the coup failed. But anyway, the point is that in this coup attempt, USAID played an integral role working hand in glove with the US military in trying to launch a military coup in February 2019 in Venezuela, along with the Colombian military and elements that had defected from the Venezuelan military and that were part of this operation. So this was not an aid operation. It was a violent military coup attempt. And this was admitted basically slightly indirectly, but it was admitted by USAID last year. In 2020, USAID published a report, or actually it might have been earlier this year. I have a report, I can post it in the comments. USAID admitted that the funding that it was using for this operation was going directly to Juan Guaido, that it was not a humanitarian aid effort. And USAID's own internal office of, like, their watchdog, their office of management, they admitted that funding was not used for actual humanitarian aid, but rather for this political operation, which they didn't call a coup, but it was a coup. Anyway, the reason I explain all of that because that's exactly what happened in Nicaragua, is that USAID used this idea that it was providing humanitarian assistance to fund the coup elements in 2018 in Nicaragua.